welcome to everybody, and we're very grateful to the Mission and Discipleship Committee for giving us this leisurely slot here from 12 to 1 p.m. South African time, of course 6 to 7 a.m. in Atlanta, and tomorrow unfortunately we're back to the same old slot. But also I want to make sure you know that Theo is opening up the videos, the pre-recorded videos, much earlier. So if you get up in the morning and you want to watch our pre-recorded video tomorrow morning, you're welcome to do so from as early as you get up. As I say, we're learning new tricks, and this is one of them, that we need to be a little bit more spacious with the time. Allow people more space to watch it at their convenience. But welcome to all of you, and welcome to Lindsay Armstrong again in the second slot. And I just want to remind you of the topic that we spoke about this morning. We spoke about the third and fourth shifts. The first one, from hard boundaries to permeable boundaries. The hard boundaries are referring to who does what and who should be in which conversations. So a very hierarchical, authoritarian structure where, the minister or the senior pastor is in charge, and there's a session of elders and so on, and nothing gets by them. Everything has to be, there's kind of the gatekeepers, and that's considered the sort of norm in the institutional inherited church. And then permeable boundaries, where there's more room for conversation and for co-creation. And then, so we'll start with that, and then about halfway through, I'll remind you of the second shift, which is leaders as experts with specific credentials and, the Presbyterian thing, high levels of education. You don't get in without the university qualification. And then moving towards leaders as catalysts, leaders who start things off, who encourage things to happen, asking questions, and basically the congregation as a vital working group of people sharing their gifts as God enables them. So that's where we are today. And Lindsay, do you want to say anything as we start?
I think you've summed it up beautifully. It's good to see all of you again. And I say we jump in.
Great. Any questions? I'll look for your hands. If you've got that electronic hand thing, that's very helpful. It's on the reaction button at the bottom of your screen. And then I'll sort of schedule the questions and call upon you as we go. If I put your hand down, don't be concerned. I've written it down on the piece of paper in front of me who's coming next. Okay, any questions?
And just while you're getting your brains moving, or maybe that's me because it's 6 a.m. and you're at noon. If I don't know what George says about this, but if you are interested in touching back on any of the things yesterday, we had the shift from churches flourishing in response to demand, or now insofar as they offer meaning. And we had that shift from hierarchical, centralized decision-making to now decentralized, participatory decision-making. So those were yesterday's, and George already summarized today. Good to see you.
Yes, I'm happy for us to go back and recap on those. If anybody wants to ask a question, perhaps you've been processing through the night and so on, and you want to touch base on that, you're very welcome. Any questions? Well, let me put a question to the group. If you have a look at our the handout that Lindsay has prepared, there are some questions under each of them. And the first question is, how might 21st century people in Southern Africa be particularly interested in permeable boundaries? Any thoughts on that? How might 21st century people living in Southern Africa be particularly interested in permeable boundaries? Oh dear, it's a tough crowd this morning, Lindsay. It's not even lunchtime.
It's not. When is lunchtime? It would be lunchtime here if it were 12.
Yeah. So, well, we kind of follow the British convention, I think, of 1 o'clock.
Ah, got it.
Squeezing this in. Oh, yes. Kevin, go ahead.
Hi, you all. Lindsay, again, thank you, for your insight and visionary perspective on all of this. One thing you mentioned under your shift 3, authentic community based on I think you said just relationships, but anyway, the point is you said modeled by Jesus and to the effect inspired by the Holy Spirit. I wanted to ask if you would just unpack in your minds how you saw Jesus modeling this shift 3 of hard boundaries into permeable boundaries.
Sure.
Am I quoting you right?
Sure. You know, even in the core 12 disciples, yes, there were different people with different roles. I mean, Judas kept the coin purse, and there were certainly different people. But as I read the Gospels, I do see a lot of empowerment of others. I see a lot of walking into a community or already being a part of a community and listening to what's on the ground first and really adopting a posture of, well, what Niebuhr would call kind of the third posture, the posture that's called for in the moment, which simply asks what's going on here. And he was very open. He did not walk in and assume that or at least he did not come off as if he walked into a situation and assumed what he needed to do and what these people needed. He waited and he listened, and he created a posture of openness to whatever was happening in the community, even to the point where he would then, shake the dust off of his feet sometimes and leave. But even then, the sending out in twos, the empowering, why don't you all go ahead and get all this kind of stuff taken care of to do. I feel like there was a lot of flow, a lot of give and take, a lot of empowerment, and a lot of community-led engagement, if you will. I don't think that's a phrase I've ever heard in the Bible, but that's what I see happening. And so this hard to permeable boundaries, for me, it became a game changer with the Ormwood Church community. And I can't remember if I told this story in the workshop or not. Does Ormwood Church ring a bell for anybody? This is not a test. I need you all to help me remember. No? Okay. Well, bottom line is we were in a situation where a church was closing, and the question was, do we need to sell the building or should we start something new in this area? And rather than deciding, we basically went and got to know the community for 3-4 months. I had coffee. I didn't know a single soul in that community. I had coffee with every leader I could get a hold of just to get to know them, find out what was on their mind. And what I was trying to figure out was, what is God doing in this community already? And how can we join to be a part? And in the end, we had this community conversation because all of these one-on-one conversations with people in Ormwood kept going so well that we thought we should have a community conversation, not about, hi, y'all, should we start a church? But tell us about your community. And I expected, maybe 12 people. I hoped for 20. I set up for 40 people, and 108 people showed up and gave me their email addresses. And what happened in that meeting is everybody came expecting the church to tell them what we had already decided we were going to do in their community. And instead, we were discerning and asking them, what do you love about this community? How would you map it? What are the strengths and weaknesses? What are the challenges? What are you hoping it will look like in 10 years? And we were only asking them questions because we knew we would need to co-create together. And once, after an hour of time together, they finally believed us it changed the dynamic, and the whole community actually started taking ownership of the church, or of the question. At least we had not posed that question to them. After this meeting, a guy came up to me and said, "Hey, I'm going to grab 30 of my neighbors or so and have a conversation about whether we should start this church. Can you join us?" I was out of town. I couldn't join them. But what happened in that switch, where we weren't telling them what we would do, is we saw the power of co-creation, and they suddenly realized they could help shape a community, and they could have some say, even though they weren't Presbyterians, even though they weren't church officials, but it would be a neighborhood church. And they finally got it, that they could really have voice, place at the table, that this was not a kind of rigid decision-making system. I mean, in the end, we were going to decide, but it was based on what we could sense happening in the community and happening with us as we engage the community, and our sense of whether we were called to be a part of what God's already doing there. And that kind of permeable boundary, that co-creation, that invitation to really be a part and actually let the new person even reshape things, it changed the energy in the room, it changed the engagement in the neighborhood, and it laid the foundation for a brand new church, even though a perfectly good church had just closed a few months before. This one, for some reason, it set a table that said, this is ours together, this is yours, this is what God will do with this community. Let's talk about it and figure out if we should do this, and then if so, what it should look like. So that kind of permeability is what stands out to me as I'm watching a lot of these newer churches that are thriving, as well as a lot of the existing ones that really are. There is a tremendous amount of access to real decision making. And last time we talked about the structures, kind of how you set up. This time it's more of a posture toward conversation and toward actual shaping.
Lindsay, thank you for that. And also, Kevin, thank you for that question, because that question comes up a lot. I know when I do seminars on missional church in congregations and presbyteries, I often hear that question. And my response is usually, as Lindsay's has been, to refer to the ministry of Jesus, particularly incidents like the healing of Bartimaeus. I mean, why would Jesus even ask Bartimaeus what he wanted? What is it that I can do for you? Is the verse. I mean, it's pretty clear that Bartimaeus is blind, and I think that if it had been me, I would just gone and done the thing. I mean, why waste any time? But he does so with a woman at the well. He does so with a rich young ruler, over and over again. And when one reads Luke 10, as Lindsay's pointed out, the sending out of the 70, you find over and over again a humble approach to going out. Sure, they're going to be sheep among wolves and all those kind of things, but it's a very humble approach of encouraging people to articulate, what they're looking for, and then trying to orientate them. It's the same with the road to Emmaus. It happens all the time. He puts the initiative, and that has been a great failing in evangelism, that we come so self-assured that we give people very little room to maneuver. But thank you for that question. I know Kim Brown had her hand up. Kim, go ahead.
I guess it's a two-part question. Firstly, on an established denomination, how do we change the mindset of people where at the moment it seems to be we need to be more controlling and give less freedom to the individual congregations? And then on the other side, how do we change the mindset of the local congregations to say, you need to have more power, you need to have more of a say, and change from what we always have been doing, and let them be creative and come up with new ways of doing church?
Yeah, what a great question. What a tricky question. I think for the first half of the question, I'd be interested in knowing why the denomination is becoming more controlling, if I can use your word. Because in addressing what's the motivations behind those practices, those bents and postures, if you will, sometimes just an acknowledgement and a conversation about what's driving that way of being can help people see it and can start to change minds. That can also not affect things nearly quickly enough as would be nice sometimes. But that's also why we really need people who even are a little bit reluctant to continue saying yes to leadership positions within the denomination. Because it does take, a culture change is so hard. We know this. But I think that over even conversations about postures and how you would relate, I have found these conversations about these shifts to be enormously helpful. Just opening a conversation and saying, well, what do you think? It starts to at least raise the question in some people's minds. I do not have all the answers on culture change and culture shift, but I do believe that if we put out the vision of what we want and what we believe God is calling us into, and have that vision and then the why behind it really driving why we're going to be a certain way, why we're going to do a certain thing, it's easier for people to they can see the what's, but they trust your why. And if why this matters, why this attitude is really important to even look at, being able to articulate that, being able to find some conversation space for that, it changes things and it opens up new possibilities. And if people can be helped to remember what it's like to be on the receiving end of certain postures, that can also be quite helpful. Maybe not in a confrontational way, but in a, there's creative ways to have those kinds of conversations, because I think every one of us have been on the receiving end of something heavy-handed that just made us want to walk away. And the more we can help each other see how people outside of our system, outside of our communities might experience or feel certain edicts or rules that might not need to be the way they are, the more we can invite some pliability. Last but not least, there are also conversations just about fear and about grief, and letting people be afraid and letting people be sad, but also naming it as such and helping people move forward in the midst of that is enormously empowering, because a lot of church people I know are scared to say what they believe is true. And they're just worried that, we're going to die in a generation or so. But they can't talk about it because that makes it more real. But the way they then live it out is being more controlling, At least that's what I'm seeing in my experience. And if we can gently invite those conversations, but courageously, and also make sure that there are people in the room who can say, but you know what I'm seeing? This may not be the end all be all, and we might be called to be a humbler church, but I'm seeing the Holy Spirit work in this way. I'm seeing the Holy Spirit work in that way. And that kind of openness to outsiders, to seeing, to naming when the Holy Spirit, we do see things that are happening, it starts to rekindle hope, and it starts to reposition the focus in some really helpful ways. Plus, it's just good to have encouragement. We all need it. So I think I blurred, started with one denominational and then went back down to the local congregation, but I think it's the same conversation at several levels. It's a sense of, okay, who do we believe God wants us to be in the world? Yes, we love the church, but we are not just regarding church as an object of our love. Instead, it's an instrument of God's love. So what does an instrument of God's love look like, act like, sound like, feel like, if we really feel called to this? And then people really do start naming for themselves things, which is nice, because we can't name it all for anyone. We can't see it all, number one, but we certainly can't always be the ones to say the tough things. Sometimes people can say it to each other a little easier, but creating those environments, that's key and number one. but also don't be afraid to jump in at the denominational level and lead, because they need more and more people who are going to think differently. And so, especially if it's not interesting, at least ask the question. You and God have a conversation about it, because that's also how you change systems.
Great. Thank you for that. Malibongwe? Go ahead, Malibongwe. I can see you there, Malibongwe, but I can't hear you. I think there's an audio problem. I can't hear.
Is it possible, Malibongwe, to type it in the chat?
Type it in the chat. I think that's a good idea, because we can't hear.
By the way, y'all, I'm pro chat. So if you all want to have a whole nother conversation in the chat, if that's okay with George and Sasha, it's good with me. So go right ahead and do what you need to do, or comment, or I probably should have screened whether I should say that with George first.
No, that's all fine. I'm happy. Kim, why don't you go ahead so long, and then we'll come back to Malibongwe's question.
I think we're sort of the reason why we're on the control level is a thing of identity, and that at the moment there's the strive to what is the UPCSA and how do we make ourselves visible as the UPCSA, and the thought behind it that we all need to be the same, that if somebody walks into this church, they need to be able to know that this is a UPCSA because everything is the same. And it's changing that mindset of we don't have to all look the same or worship the same. We can still be the UPCSA even if we're different. I think that's, for me, is where we need to try and work at.
That's fascinating. I would not have expected that kind of implied or explicit mandate. That's helpful to hear. I am surprised because around here, we've simply given up on trying to be the same. We don't even agree on political matters, let alone theological ones. And so we've really had painful, heart-wrenching conversations and exchanges and close votes where, people left all unhappy and unable to believe that this person they thought they liked actually votes that way. And we've just been through years of that and finally had to claim that our unity is not in agreement and our unity is in Christ. And this, and in being Christ's people, it is not in agreement at all. Though we can claim certain core theological convictions. And we have had that, that has been hard won and difficult at times. But I'll tell you, I'd say we are about 8, maybe 9, 10 years past a kind of breaking point for us. And we really had to focus in on what makes us family and what doesn't, and what the key pieces are and what they aren't. And it has changed us. The trust levels now are at a whole different place than they were even 8 years ago. So I wish you well in that struggle. That's a hard one.
But you still persist in using that nasty Robert's rules. And if you want a better system, I can send you one. It's in a doctoral dissertation. And then if you apply that, it might be better, Lindsay.
Mm-hmm. We use an odd combination of Roberts and a consensus decision making.
But not enough. Here we go. So let me have a look here. There's a question. What happens if you realize you're not a catalytical leader? what would you recommend? Should ministers do leadership training, or rather look for people in the congregation to fulfill that role?
I love it. Thank you, Melanie. I think most of us were trained to be experts rather than catalysts, and or at least in the systems that I've been a part of, we certainly are. And I believe in leadership training. I think you learn a lot out of leadership training, and I want us to lean all in on leadership training. I do think we can get lost in it. I think we could do it maybe a little too much sometimes, but I don't find that to be the overwhelming problem by any stretch. If we find that we are more experts than catalysts, I actually think that that means we have permission to lead in the Presbyterian Church, so we're in a good spot. But B, now we know what to look for. Because if you can spot the catalysts in your church, or the catalysts in your community, or the catalysts who are also involved in the kind of thing that your church has a vocation toward. I mean, maybe you are heavily involved in education or in some work to eradicate homelessness in this particular area, or whatever it is. You can spot the catalysts and basically come alongside them, befriend them, be a part with them, make them a part of the network, do joint kind of ministry. And I think that is one way that, much like we all have gifts that fit together and we don't need everybody with the same gifts. I think that kind of leadership, it does galvanize people. It gets people moving in a certain direction. And that is one thing that some of our churches need. So find those people, tap them, and make sure that you all are collaborating and on the same page about many things. So they can't help themselves. Catalysts, they're just going to keep getting things stirred up and going. And it's helpful if you all have a shared vision. So if you are not that catalyst, that's fine. Good. Own it, and also then look to round out the leadership circle and your own personal network, your professional network, as well as the leadership circle in the church. That would be my recommendation.
There's a great follow-up question, Lindsay, that Melanie has posted. She said, should this change the kind of people that we admit to the ministry? And it's an interesting question because it was something that confronted the church a few years ago. The Mission and Discipleship Committee challenged our ministry committee on the basis of Alan Hirsch's APEST, apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds or pastors, and teachers in Ephesians. And so we said to them, be honest, which of these do you admit to the ministry and which do you send away? And they said, we admit pastors and teachers, the rest we send away. We send them either to mission organization or parachurch organizations. We say, look, there's no space in the church. And we said to them, well, you get the church that you plan for. So if you only choose bureaucrats like George, and a handful of teachers and people, who love the congregation, you're not going to get, church planters, which is the apostolic gifts. You're not going to get evangelists who are able to preach and teach in such a way that people just, sort of want to come closer. And you're certainly not going to get the prophets. And it was interesting. At that point, they gave us the assurance that they were opening up their worldview a little in terms of admission to the ministry. So, yeah, it's a great question.
Mm-hmm. That is. I love it. Yeah.
Okay, here's Malibongwe's question. The dilemma for me is that we are notorious in our polity and order. The shifts will impact heavily on our understanding of this polity. Is there space to make shifts within the polity? I guess that's Presbyterian polity. Or do we need to have a serious conversation about our polity? We need to reorient ourselves through conversations if we embrace any of these shifts. So it's about the structure of the church, the inherent Presbyterian structure.
Mm-hmm. The broad sweeps of the Presbyterian structure, I'm a big fan of. I mean, some ways it plays out locally or even denominationally in our various areas can have surprising differences, even though we're quite sure sometimes that those are absolute essentials to being Presbyterian, when in fact, maybe if we were to compare notes on a few things, they aren't. I believe, well, I am still a part of the church, so you're already seeing my bias to your question. I think we can do a lot of change from within. And I believe that we should try. We are the ones who have been given the gift of leadership positions in the church. And yes, I do think, back to Melanie's question, we should, and to George's reply, we should continue to diversify the kinds of leaders that we welcome in and try to make a broader array possible as well as celebrated. But no, I think, frankly, that we, I think there's space to make these shifts within the polity, because these shifts are not total shifts. They're not it's not all or nothing. These are posture shifts, and people are tending this way. And even in the business world, these are shifts that big companies are talking about, and they are not dissolving their structures. Instead, what they're doing is saying, okay, these are actual shifts in the way humans are behaving now. And if we keep behaving this way, we're going to keep alienating a lot of workers, as well as we'll be missing out on a lot of skill and opportunity. How can we, and so this is the question that I think we do, how can we be attentive to these shifts given how we're also set up? When can we bend and flex, and when can't we? And so, sure, maybe one day there's a bigger overhaul of polity coming, but I believe there's a lot. We have everything that we need within our current polity, and we figure out when and how these shifts work for us and when they don't. None of this is meant to be a breaking point. It was once then, now it's this. Instead, these are newer postures that are primary in a lot of people throughout the world these days. And I've been surprised ever since I, much to my surprise, kind of discovered it and walked into it. I've been looking for evidence of it elsewhere, and I'm finding it. Corporations are redesigning based on these posture shifts so that they can have more people at the table who are more knowledgeable make decisions that make a better, well, for them it's a product, but for us it would be a more flourishing engagement with the world. So Malibongwe, it's a little vague because I can't get into the specifics of what kind of polity pieces you're thinking of, but I think that the conversation will lead to some answers, and it's not, it doesn't happen just like that. It's very contextual. It is what is appropriate now, what is called for now. Is there something in this that we can learn from that will help us address this problem, this issue, this opportunity? And I think that slowly but surely those postures seep through the culture of the whole church and start to change it, the more and more we help each other see it.
I also have a remark. I can see Andrew Snyders wants to ask a question. Let me just make a remark quickly before on this very question that Malibongwe has raised. I think there is a lot of room to maneuver within the polity. And I want to tell you a very quick and a short story, which I often use to illustrate the difference between our polity and the perceptions of the polity. So the story was told to me years ago when I was studying for the ministry by a Catholic priest. He was talking about an old, one of the desert fathers that was living in a cave generations and generations ago in that era. And this man was known for his great wisdom, and he was a very venerable saint, and people used to come and visit him from all over the show to get his advice about certain things. And they would go up to this cave and they'd sit there in the entrance, and the father would be sitting there on the floor, and he would be in prayer and so on, and then he would come out of his time of prayer and meditation and answer the question. But people also noticed that from time to time a cat was coming into this cave. It was just walking into the cave and sort of, rubbing up against the father and so on. But when he was in times of meditation, this irritated him. So he had this little leash made, and he tied the cat to a post. I don't know how this is possible, because if you've ever had a cat, they don't really, respond well to being controlled. But anyway, this is the story. And when the father died, people were very distraught because he was such a revered man. But they used to go back up to the cave and sit there, even in his absence. And strangely, the Lord would reveal himself to them. But they wanted to do something to memorialize the father. And so they remembered the cat. And so they had a post made and a special golden leash and, a statue of a cat. And this reminded them of the father. And what my teacher was teaching me is that sometimes there is the important and the real thing, and there's also a lot of attachments. The cat had nothing to do with the venerable saint, nor the words of wisdom that came from his lips, and yet it had become attached. And I wonder whether a lot of what Malibongwe and others are speaking about when they speak about our polity is not necessarily something that runs to the center of the polity, but rather the attachments that we've put on over the years. I mean, I'm amazed of how many traditions and customs we have that are spoken of nowhere in our manual of faith and order, or in general Presbyterian practice. It's just things we do and stuff we've done, and this sometimes gets in the way. And if we identified those things, perhaps this polity question would become a little easier. Anyway, Andrew, you're next.
Yeah. First, can I just say, Lindsay, thank you so much for the content that you provided so far. It's been really thought-provoking for me, just hearing what you've shared so far. So I'm really looking forward to tomorrow. And just to preface my question quickly, I missed the first few minutes of the Zoom call because I had somebody at the church door. So if you already answered this, please just say so, and I'll watch the recording. But my question is, in terms of, I think it was when you were talking about the catalyst leadership and how looking broader at the type of people we're looking for the catalyst leaders, and we're not looking for the more, generally older or experienced people, that we might be looking towards young people as well for the catalyst leader. My question is one of so it's a particular interest of mine in being involved in youth work and youth ministry in the denomination. But culturally speaking, in some cultures, the youth are not respected enough to be seen as a leader, particularly towards older people. And I know I appreciate that you've said a number of times that you're speaking from the context that you've experienced and not necessarily a South African one. But I suppose my question is, have you, in the number of congregations you've been involved with in worshiping communities, have you been involved with one where culturally speaking, the youth aren't necessarily held in high regard or seen as leaders, and how have you been able to see maybe that attitude change or grow or develop within that culture and within that context, because maybe that might feed into something down here for us as well. Yeah.
Interesting. What a great question. I have been in those contexts, but it's different because a lot of I would say 13 of the communities that I work with are originated outside of the United States. And so they are either refugee or immigrant communities, bringing their own culture, traditions, etc., and establishing in a new land. And a lot of times the traditions of the people do venerate the elders and do not raise the youth. The catch and the big difference here for us is that the youth generally adapt to a new country faster. They learn the language more quickly, and they then have a lot of the skills that their parents and elders need. And so I have watched this flipped, but it's in those kind of contexts. And so in watching the youth lead, they have revolutionized churches, because you're absolutely right. A lot of youth are catalysts, and they just are fearless. They get it done. They know how to use a lot of tools like social media, etc., that galvanize people. And so in the context that I'm thinking of more immediately, yes, that is a tricky one. And the reason the youth have become bona fide leaders is because they know the skills faster that the rest of the church needs. Now, I'm trying to think of a few contexts where it's not new immigrant or refugee, because I do think that flips the narrative. And I think that I do see it in churches that integrate youth at every level. The churches that will have a youth person play their, lead music one day or offer the special music, even though they can't come to choir every week, and therefore pay their dues in order to get a spot to be able to offer the special music. Particularly during COVID, I'm watching a lot of flipping of the script on the youth leadership, because I hate speaking so broadly and painting so generally, but the technological know-how needed to do church well right now is often residing in the youth. And they are being called up and empowered and given roles that they wouldn't have had. This is also making our session meetings very permeable, because people are being invited in to make decisions because the current session doesn't have certain skill sets needed for this kind of decision making and that kind of COVID related decision making. One thing that's also happening around here that is a COVID opportunity, so few of those, but let's claim everyone we can, is that, and I don't love this and I don't necessarily agree with it, but we do have some communities that are trying some socially distanced worship outside, limit the numbers, etc. But they're really only inviting the people who definitely check the box on not a vulnerable population, which means it's a lot of youth. And then everybody watches the worship services that they're leading. And so suddenly we have a lot more of the youth in leadership positions that they were not previously in. And I have a feeling that that will continue forward, because for 7 months, they've shown up and offered leadership that the rest of the community has appreciated, has needed, that very exhausted pastors have also been thankful for. And so we have a habit of placing 2 youth on the session every year. Just as a denomination, we encourage that. We have YAVs, the Young Adult Volunteers. We have youth delegates to the General Assembly. And so we also try to encourage this kind of a culture that allows for more permeability. The catch is pretty much once they turn 24, then they disappear. So in terms of actually saying, you have gifts, you are a total callous, this kind of thing, tapping on the shoulders, celebrating it, a couple of other little things that have happened that are starting to flip the leadership script is, and it's not flipping the script, what it's doing is just broadening the pool of who can be considered a leader of the church. I'm watching a number of churches start to celebrate other kinds of skills. It's not just the Sunday school teachers and the session members who are acknowledged in worship, but also, okay, let's see who did more social media posting for our church over this last month and a half, and celebrate that person, recognize them as a major volunteer for the church. And this kind of creative acknowledgement of what different people are doing. And if it is a 9-year-old boy, fantastic. And if it is an 83-year-old elderly lady who cannot leave, but she writes more handwritten notes to every single person who needs a handwritten note, celebrate her. And so that kind of like, how on Instagram there's those, you focus on a little person, you do kind of a little 1-minute expose. These kinds of opportunities to really celebrate and to see the ministry of such a range of people is starting to then raise questions and broaden the imagination about who and how we lead and what it really looks like. Yes, session members need to be this, but that doesn't mean they're the only ones leading. And so now we're celebrating more than just the people who go on mission trips, the Sunday school leaders and the session. And it's interesting and dynamic to watch. And it's just that little one person featured a week kind of a thing to do a shout out for their ministry. And that starts to then engage other people and go, oh, you know what? Have you seen so-and-so? Guess what they do every week? And so that has started to help. And frankly, Catalyst kind of came up with that one. But that has been a way that the imagination has been broadened. And frankly, the church has become more proud. Because if you celebrate it and lift it up, everybody can kind of go, wow, that's really remarkable. I wouldn't have known otherwise. And we got to celebrate each other because it's hard enough. Let's just go ahead and help each other out. Did that get to your question, Andrew?
Yeah, no, it definitely did help. I do think it's just overall a challenge. I mean, you said, for example, they hit 24 and then they head out, and the nature of the variety of cultures down here, for example, is like our youth fellowship of youth, or fellowship of youth, I think it's called. That age limitation is up to the age of 35, which we regard as, like in kind of urban congregations, you regard that as a young adult, and so it's an interesting kind of challenge of looking at youth not only as young adults, but also towards kind of teenagerhood and younger as well. Yeah. So yeah. Sorry, my internet's a bit funny.
Yeah.
Great.
There's I'll just shout out this one little book. You can read it in half an hour, or so. Just find it on the internet if you can. You don't need to buy it. It's by a guy named Seth Godin, and it's called Tribes. And basically what he's saying is, look, everybody's a leader. And this is a cultural shift, except that it's being accepted even in places where this is culturally not the case. And basically what he says is, in today's networked world, so it's again a matter of access. How is access affecting your church? In today's network world, anyone can lead. And what the secret of leadership then is very simple. Do what you believe in. Paint a picture of the future. Go there. People will follow. Give people access to you and each other. Connect. Ask the same kind of questions that they're asking. And this is, I'm seeing, changing a lot of cultures that would really only empower certain ages. But it's a matter of access. Anybody can lead now.
Another question here from Tequila. And he's saying, Catalyst leaders will not push to the front if the platform is not prepared for them to operate. Is it possible to make this kind of leadership part of the curriculum for ministers at seminary level, so that they will be able to release people into ministry that the ministry that God is calling them into? And then I'm just aware of time, and if there's one last question after this one of Lentequile, please put up your hand, and then we'll schedule that last question. But go ahead, Lindsay.
Yeah, I have a feeling that the theological education that we've all enjoyed is probably looking at a major overhaul in many directions. I like the classical theological education personally, and can go get the other skills wherever else. But the leadership curriculum I'm seeing in U.S. theological institutions does indeed start to venture into the cultivation, encouragement, identification of catalyst leaders, and really trying to do both and bridge. Have trained, qualified leaders who are experts, as well as those who really know how to identify that they have catalyst capabilities and how to use them. And then the other leaders who really just don't have that, but are fantastic in other ways, being able to identify that and to figure out how to bring leadership, different kinds of skills together is really one thing I am seeing in some seminaries, like, but this is all local to me. I mean, it's like Columbia Theological Seminary, their leadership track, which is led by Jeffrey Tribble. He really is intentional about this kind of a thing. I think, so the theological education question is huge. I think it will by necessity continue to change and lead that way. And I think that the leadership development, leadership training folks are starting to head there. I also think, however, that in terms of ministry assessment, in terms of reaching out and saying, you have skills for ministry, have you thought about going to seminary? I think we need to notice a wider range of people. That's an evangelist, the people who have those kinds of skills, because even if it doesn't, I think the seminaries will be a little slower to change in terms of core curriculum, maybe not in terms of lifelong learning. But what can change more and more quickly is who we look for to call up into ministry and who we want to recommend for this congregation or that congregation or that congregation. And so, yes, I believe that it will continue to merge in more to the seminary. But I also think it has a place at the assessment level and at our level as we take seriously the cultivation of the next generations.
Oops, sorry. Any last questions?
Now, I can't quite read the chat. I said I'm pro chat, but I can't actually do it very well. So if there's something in the chat that I need to know about, let me know.
I think the chat's clear at the moment.
Yeah, yeah. I would be curious for you all, just in, do you have certain catalysts in your church whose gifts, because frankly, catalyst gifts can go awry, but whose gifts could be really identified, celebrated, lifted up, and put to use on a certain matter, certain issue. I'm very curious as to where we see them. And they're not, I mean, we all probably have some, both of us. We're both experts and catalysts in many ways. But most of us lean one way or the other a little bit more. I'd be real interested to know where the catalysts in your church can be found. And
any responses? Go ahead, share, Kevin.
Yeah, one example that comes to mind in a congregation I was previously in, one of our younger members, he was in secular work in business. He was a great ideas guy. You know, if you had something that you were thinking, okay, how do we do this as a church? He just had an amazing gift to just say, well, we can do this. This is how we can do that. You know, very practically. And we find ourselves often looking to him to just get the ideas. He was an ideas man. He wasn't necessarily an implementer, but he had the vision to be able to come up with a picture or a story, an idea, and then we pass it to the implementers. Is that an example?
Most definitely, yeah. And I love to see those people, the ideas people, in with other ideas people. I mean, one of the great fun pieces of church work really is getting to test ideas. I mean, you sense a call, you get a clear sense of okay, what God is who God is asking us to be, how we are going to be an instrument of God's in this context, in this, with this people, and just test ideas about what that can mean with people inside and outside of the church, and get those ideas people together, and with the implementers too, because you have to have both feet on the ground sometimes, or at least 1.5 feet on the ground, and let them. You can't let them go crazy, but yeah, letting them actually play, it brings so much energy.
I think it's about hearing them in the first place, saying, wow, well, this guy's got something to contribute to in terms of the prospects of where we feel God might want to take us. But he was able to put the picture together.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Andrew, go ahead.
I actually just want to latch on to what Kevin said. I love the fact that you mentioned the guy was a dreamer, but not necessarily, or has a vision, but not necessarily an implementer. Because I just want to say, I think one of the problems, I don't know how widespread this problem is, but I've encountered in a number of churches, which is the one with the vision gets the job. And I can't stand that statement, because it causes people who have the visionary aspects not to come forward. The catalysts don't come forward then, because they're like, I don't know where to start with this thing, but I've got this idea. And so I think for me, like, the one thing I'm hoping to kind of see is to break down that mindset of, if you come with the idea, you're going to take it and run with it. Because it's hindering two people. It's hindering both implementer, who doesn't have the dream or the vision, and the dreamers who can't implement. And so, yeah, like, unfortunately, I can't directly answer the question you asked, Lindsay, in terms of people, particularly at the moment in the congregation I serve at. But I just want to make that kind of statement of, we need to be so wary of that mindset, even though we're not necessarily teaching it or saying it, it might exist anyway. And we need to be very actively involved in breaking down that mindset, I think, to encourage catalysts to come forward. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and this is a tricky one, because there are people who just want to spin ideas and have other people go do them, and that can be exhausting. And there are genuine, catalyst, ideas, visions, moments that need to be discerned as, ooh, Holy Spirit, we might need to lean in on this. And unfortunately, they are fewer and far between, because we only have so much time in a day. But I will say this one last thing, and I'll just say it bluntly since we're short on time. One thing about catalysts is that they are willing to take the lead, and they have the ability to connect with people who also want to get involved. And they do this because they're articulating shared questions. They are asking a question that everybody nods their head about. And they are offering a vision that is compelling, that catches the breath, that elicits some passion. And they have maybe not all the ideas, but they at least have an idea about a next step. And so these catalysts, they may not have the credentials or the training, but to really not just put a great idea out there, but to really catalyze change, there is a willingness to lead and an ability to connect. And that ability to connect, I have a friend who is so brilliant. He comes up with ideas all the time. He is absolutely amazing. And he does not galvanize people at all because of the way he is. And I love him, but he's not a catalyst. He's a fantastic ideas guy. And so I want to make sure that when we're looking for these catalysts, they do have an ability to connect and galvanize and get people wanting to go in a certain direction. I mean, George is curious, I think, is one of them. I don't know what he would say to that. I bet you there's a lot in this room, but it's, yes, the ideas people that we cannot be afraid of or squelch, but they also have the willingness to keep leading on this. And that's an important piece I just want to mention.
Okay. I think we're out of time. I do want to mention Royden's question. I think it's a good one to go away and think about. He says, how do we move from suspicion of those who are catalysts outside institutionalized church to drawing them into church councils or sessions to speak to the status quo? It's a good thing to think about. What are the kinds of ways we could encourage that? How can we make a safe space? But then let me also say one other thing, and I'm sorry to end on a negative note, but speaking from the experience, 22 years, in the ministry, I think there's a fair deal of laziness about. And I'm not talking specifically about ministers here. I'm speaking about the congregation, because when you ask the congregation sometimes what they believe, then they will say, well, just ask him, ask George, he'll tell you. And that's not good enough. And I've often said to members of the church, listen, I'm not doing intellectual entertainment here. I'm not going to do a Bible study on the Proverbs just because you haven't had one before. We need to have something that's useful so as to equip you to be, to do the works of service in the world. That's the most important thing. The most important thing for me to do is to equip you to do ministry. And this business of just pointing to me and I'm expected to answer on your behalf, it's not going to gel with me. You need to own your faith, and you need to own your responsibility as a member of Christ's church. Take your and as a witness, I think it's absolutely vital. But thank you so much, Lindsay. Another very stimulating discussion. And just to remind everybody, so we spoke about hard boundaries versus permeable boundaries, experts versus catalysts. And now tomorrow, and we're back to the old slot of 11:30 a.m. and 5:30 a.m. for Lindsay. But the last two shifts are very important, and I hope you enjoy the pre-recorded video, because we're going to talk about moving from a focus on material and financial capital to reputational and social capital, and then, very importantly, especially in a COVID-19 world or a post-COVID-19 world to come, we're talking about a shift from the church gathered to the church scattered. And we're all experts on that now. We've had 6 or 7 months of it. We know how to do church scattered. And the great challenge is not to lose those skills going forward. Because as far as Lindsay's concerned, this is a shift that's happening, and we need to be ready to minister into that situation. So thank you for signing up. We're going to try to put the recording on soon so that it's there for posterity. But then tomorrow, 11:30 a.m., we'll be online again for our last interactive session in this workshop series. Okay, bye-bye, everybody.